So going back to garbage collection earlier, one of the things you said at the talk that stuck with me because it's just such an unusual thing to see was, you're aware that you're talking about a systems language with manual memory management to an audience full of functional programmers. And you basically said like, well, let me sort of like defend my choice of, making a systems language with manual memory management to an audience that's like, obviously like defaulting to the opposite of that. The reason that resonated with me is I feel the reverse whenever I'm talking to somebody who's really hardcore about performance, like you or Casey, where I'm like, well, let me defend my choice of making a language with automatic memory management because I care about performance and want things to go fast. But like, I also think that this has value. In your ideal world, is it that like everybody uses manual memory management for everything and knows how to do it well and creates the highest possible quality software? Or do you think there's a world where there is room for someone to make software that's like a high enough quality that you kind of can't tell the difference? Obviously, this is not going to work in like a super high performance game, but there's lots of other software that we use all the time. But like, I'm just kind of curious, like on a philosophy level, like how do you think about like, was garbage collection just a mistake or is there room for it in the world?
Well, I am not absolutist about this. I am not at all a person who says there should not be garbage collection. And there's one form of thought pattern or argumentation that I like to use about all these things, which is find the point at which it's obviously not the case, and then look at where I am. And the real point for this decision about should you use garbage collection is somewhere in the middle. And maybe there's arguments about where in the middle that point is, but it's just an argument about where to turn the knob, right? Mm-hmm. So, which is then automatically not really a religious argument anymore, because religious arguments are all like things should be or things should not be, or it should be the best. So for example, there are a lot of people, and this is not to denigrate garbage collection in any way. This is me going all the way to the other end of the spectrum, right? To find this point and ignore the fact that LLMs are becoming a thing now and people are using those for programming, because this is an argument that goes back a few years, but it's just like, look, there's all sorts of people who are not professional programmers. Professional programming is hard. There's a lot to know. It's very difficult to put these systems together, but there's lots of cases in which you want some programmability for, like, I don't know, like the guys runs a store and he wants to control what is on the sign that is now run by a computer or whatever, right?
Sure.
Or you could think of all these things. There's a scientist in a lab who's like a chemist and he doesn't really know how to program, but he wants to do some data analyses or some visualizations or whatever, right? So there's all these categories where obviously if you say you should be as hardcore as a professional programmer, no, chemistry dude wants to do chemistry research. He shouldn't have to, right? And so there's this aspect of like, on that end of the spectrum, it's about bring the functionality of computers to that person. And probably, a garbage collected language is the most appropriate thing for those contexts, right? Now, on my end, for what I do, I really don't want garbage collection. In video games, one thing that happens is people make games in C#, which is a garbage collected language. And they do that because they perceive that it will be easier. Whether it actually is or not, who knows? That's a different argument, but they perceive that. And because common popular game engine Unity, that's the main way to write code if you're using Unity, is to do some C# stuff, right? So, but a classic thing that happens is you start your game and you're like, oh, this is really fast. My game is small and simple. Garbage collection is not going to be a problem. And then it ends up being a problem by the time you're trying to ship, because in games, it's very tangible. Like the frame rate will start to stutter, right, in unpredictable ways.
Yeah.
And so then there's all these things like, hey, just pool all your objects and all these things and do all this manual memory management and reduce load on the garbage collector, right? And that's true that helps, but that's all the stuff you would have done if you were manually managing memory anyway. But then also you end up in this frustrating position with some of these systems where you can't really control. Like, you can reduce garbage collection in a limited amount of your own code, right? But at some point that becomes infeasible. And then also you're using third-party libraries that are generating garbage in a way that you can't control. And some of them may be quite aggressive about generating garbage, right? And so you end up in this place. I've seen a lot of games end up in an unhappy place there. Anyway, this is all just to say there's a spectrum, and somewhere along the line of use cases that's not so extreme as like only non-professional programmers, and is also not so extreme as like we need to run at 120 FPS on a small consumer video game console, right? Um, Somewhere in between there, I think there is a garbage collection use case for sure.
That makes sense. I do wonder about within games. The example that immediately comes to mind is Roblox and Luigit. I guess they have their own flavor of Luigit, where I guess the use case is essentially
Yeah.
like you want to be able to run on one player's machine untrusted content from another user, and being able to have a really strong sandbox, which Lua does in addition to being garbage collected, which I think is hard to do if you're not going to be garbage collected. Um, Seems like a selling point unto itself. And that's not just a games use case. That's also like any kind of plugins or extensions for anything. Like if you can have a really reliable sandbox around it, that's a potential selling point.
Yes. Yes, you can to some degree sandbox systems code like that. However, um, as soon as you start doing that, you run into all these issues where like modern operating systems kind of drop the ball at some point and don't really allow you to do things that you wish you would be able to do. So like you would like to create a separate thread or some kind of other memory context and say like, okay, well, if you do write through a pointer to something, you only have write permissions to certain things, and there you go. And that's actually not really possible to do without like creating a separate process. And then once you have another process, communication to that process is like annoying and subject to certain constraints and all these things. And I don't know. That's not I've never gone down the road of engineering that kind of a thing, but this also comes up in like Roblox is an extreme example, right? Where like some 13-year-old kid wrote code that's running on your machine,
Right.
and who knows what that is, right? But you know, even with things, this comes up um, with plugins for just regular programs. So like an editor, right? Um, there's all this stuff, you know, language server protocol stuff that I hate. Um, that was designed for basically two reasons, as far as I can tell. One of the reasons was that the people who do JavaScript and other things back at that time when this was introduced didn't want to ever interface with any systems level thing. And so these traditional ways that you would do plugins, like having a dynamic library that you load that conforms to a known interface, which is how plugins have been done since the 90s, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very fast, highly performant, highly structured, and therefore good at reducing certain kinds of bugs way of doing these things. And one of the reasons why it's good that you don't have with like language server protocol is you can just share data structures across this abstraction boundary the way you can. So you can pass very complex structured data back and forth. You don't have to serialize and deserialize and reparse and look for parse errors in the frickin' thing and all these things that
Right.
happens as soon as you're serializing. So that's how plugins have been done since the 90s. But the problem is, if your plugin authors are not as trusted, it doesn't even have to be like, you know, no level of trust, but just like, I kind of don't trust that this plugin isn't going to crash a lot or whatever, right? And then you're trying to run it, and again, you have to isolate that plugin in a separate process, because if it's in your same process, you kind of can try to recover from an exception in that code, but like it's pretty dicey, and the magnitude of what you can do varies on different operating systems, and there are certain things that are just unrecoverable. So like if another process like uh, acquires a mutex somewhere, or let's not even do that. If there's some common code used by both of you that uses like a lock-free synchronization mechanism where it just like increments an integer that you're supposed to decrement again before leaving the code, and then it crashes, and now you're just screwed. Like everything is just broken, right? And so So I think for these reasons, these are things that we could have fixed in systems land if we cared, but at some point, everybody gave up and stopped trying to make serious. I don't know. People like decided things were solved and then let them decay. I'm not sure what happened, but there's all these things that we actually don't solve. This is also why containers are a big thing. Like we used to have a name for a system that would reliably rerun the same program over time. It was called the operating system, right? And like somehow we let the operating system stop doing that, and now people are like, oh, containers, containers, and it's like that used to be the operating system. So now we've got an even bigger mess now, right? There's all these things that systems people, I would say, is their fault. Like it's their fault for letting things get this messy and effed up, but the supposed solution for these things is like stuff like language server protocol, which has a large number of flaws and is very slow and limited, and also doesn't even really solve the problem. So like, okay, I've got a plugin I'm talking to over LSP and it crashes. And like, if you actually really want to recover from that robustly, it's maybe not as bad as like the lock-free integer case that I mentioned, but like it can actually be really complicated in your code to like try to recover from this thing stopping responding at arbitrary points anywhere, right?
I also would like for there to be a viable alternative to like language server protocol that doesn't require a server to like do extensions. Obviously that's the most popular thing, but I'm also frustrated that something that has that much overhead is the dominant way that everybody does these things.
Yeah, it's kind of and part of what's going on is like people don't like web programmers have not grown up and may never have seen at all the ability to pass a large sophisticated data structure between code written by you know just running in different processes, even, for example, right?
Yeah.
Or I don't know, whatever, and so it doesn't when you say, oh, I'm going to serialize this because I'm sending it over the network to this other process on my machine, it makes sense because it's like, oh, that's just like what you do with a web server. And it's like, actually, no, there's something a lot better that you could do, right? And because it's not in that subsector of the programming culture, people aren't bothered by it, I guess. But yeah, I mean, the thing that bothers me more than the inefficiency of all that is, yeah, like why is nobody working on operating systems now? Right? Like why are I mean, we essentially have operating system designs that were finalized in the 70s. Either so Windows NT, right? Um, the acronym for that is WNT, which is VMS incremented by one letter. And that's not an accident, right? Like its design was inspired by the design of VMS, which is an operating system from the 60s and 70s. And then, of course, everything else is Unix, uh, which is also 1970s, right? And
Yep.
so, like, these things have been refined a bit since then, but the fundamental concepts are like literally 55 years old. And like we kind of haven't progressed those core concepts very much. There have been some things, Rob Pike was trying to do some stuff with Plan 9 that didn't catch on. Again, that was all about serializing and deserializing, so I don't love that. But like, look, he was trying to do a thing there, right? And then I don't know, we just kind of gave up on operating systems. And then some people might say, oh, that's because it's solved, but it's not solved. Like we have these very real problems that like, the reason you can tell is that it's an unsolved problem is when there's kind of like no right answer within the current framework to what should you do. So what should I do if I want a fully robust untrusted plugin running on my machine with my code? And the only answers you can come up with that are like,
JSON.
some crazy thing like run a web browser embedded in the process, and then run some JavaScript in the web browser, and never mind that JavaScript can break out of its sandbox, acts, in all sorts of ways. Because I mean, the bigger and more complicated the system had to get, because it's the web, the more vulnerabilities you have, right? So we just don't have a good solution for that. There should be one. Like, I sort of feel like there should be, like, systems people should have gotten together and done a thing that is like Java bytecode, but is not married to any particular backend. It's just like, look, it's an abstracted version of machine instructions that just operates on memory. And then if you want a protected memory environment over that and all that, you can do that. If you want it to be garbage collected, you can do that. But at its core, it's just this heavily sandboxed, you know, virtual machine that runs the same everywhere. And like, that should be like a standard thing that all operating systems run, and they don't.